Tiffany,
Yes.
I'm really interested to get straight into this actually, because one of the things I love is when people tell me about history, but through a different lens.
Yeah.
So what I'd like for you is, if you could, give me a potted history of privacy. Have we always been obsessed with privacy, and what's people's kind of feeling about privacy been going back through history?
Okay, well, the lens that I use to try and understand history is the division between what is made public and available and what is made private, kept to ourselves. And I think it's a really interesting division that you can sort of apply to any society. Every society has some sort of division. And look particularly at the West. And I'd started this book initially because I wanted to know where privacy came from. So we talk about privacy all the time, how we need it, how it's under threat. You just think, well, where does it come from? Because it certainly isn't a natural thing. And you go back to the 17th century, which is when I really begin, and privacy was seen as dangerous, almost frightening. It was something that only adulterers and murderers would have. And I think people probably experienced it with a certain amount of anxiety as well. It wasn't just because it was a communal society and everybody lived together. The people who were rich, living in huge castles, who had all the money in the world, would also have feared privacy. I think it was a sort of state when the devil could come to you. So I try and look at where does it come from, and I kind of situate it not in property, but really in the mind, in battles over the mind. And that sort of takes you up to the kind of golden age, and it's a peculiar thing to call it a golden age, the golden age of privacy, which is the Victorians. They loved privacy. I mean, they talked about privacy all the time. It was almost like a national value. You had this big separation between public life and people's private lives. What happened behind closed doors was something that people didn't talk about. You could really just sort of pull the curtain, and the government and the public wouldn't go in.
And there was that concept of decency as well. That closing the curtain was about privacy, but necessary privacy to protect others.
Yeah, I mean, I think the home itself was a sort of domestic fortress, and you were meant to behave in certain ways. You were meant to behave with decency. You weren't meant to kind of talk about your business in public. That was kind of vulgar and disgraceful. I mean, one thing that privacy did then was obviously hide all sorts of things that you weren't allowed to do in society. Sort of unnatural crimes, for example, adultery, things that were forbidden happened in private. Privacy did sort of protect people. Not all people, it has to be said. It didn't protect women, for example. So I'm really interested in the way in which, particularly in the Victorian period, the kind of massive respect for privacy was something that meant women could be beaten behind closed doors. So I talk about a case called State versus Rhodes, which is in America. And the woman, Elizabeth Warren, takes her husband to court for beating her, which was illegal. He says, yes, I beat her. I can't remember really why. It was something she said, but I beat her. And he was found guilty of beating her, but not punished. Because the judge, and it's this fascinating reading, the judge talks about how intruding into the private realm would be more dangerous than, because it was sort of, it would be kind of disrespectful of the patriarch, but also of the private realm, then actually it would be much better to kind of respect that kind of curtain. So privacy is...
So essentially he felt the law shouldn't cross over a certain line.
Yeah, very much so. And in fact, wife beating was something that throughout the sort of Victorians and onwards, people, particularly feminists, have tried to outlaw. I think rape wasn't outlawed amongst a man and a woman in marriage until 1992. So privacy does hide bad things, and if we even think of our own lives, what we do in private we're not always our best selves. But I still think it's very, very important. And so I do argue for a strict division between public and private, which I think we've lost. I argue that even scumbags require privacy, not wife beaters, though.
Interesting. You touched on something just then that made me remember. I made a documentary about abortion in Kenya, where abortion is illegal. And I interviewed a lawyer who's on the right, big in the Catholic movement. And I said to him, abortion being illegal means that all these women are having to do it in back rooms and quiet places, and they're not able to be regulated, and we're not able to keep them safe. But you say that you're interested in safety, and he said, that's exactly where I want it to be. I want it to be in the dark, quiet, back places where nobody talks about it. And you made me think of him, because, yes, privacy is a thing that we will enforce sometimes in order to push people away and ultimately restrict their rights.
I think people in mental homes, people in prisons, they don't have privacy. It is a kind of luxury, but people who do bad things will do it in private. They don't want you to see. It is a kind of, and I think the interesting things over abortion in the States is that it was a kind of, it's no longer seen as a private act. It's seen as something that people can have a say on, kind of argue over. It's become very political.
I think that was his point. He wanted it sort of hidden away so that we don't talk about it. And if you're going to even go there, then you're going to have to hide away. Almost privacy as a sort of as a weapon, forcing people into this space.
Yeah, and I think perhaps there's a degree of... I think the question is, do we live now in a shame culture? Because I think he would have argued that not only should it happen in private, but it's a shameful thing.
Absolutely.
So I do think there's a degree to which in our society we don't any longer think there are things that are shameful. And therefore that is one of the reasons why people are much more open about their sexuality, about what they do. There's a sense that if you've got nothing to hide, then it's fine, to do it in public.
That brings me to my next thought, because obviously we usually talk about privacy in the context of social media and technology. But listening to you there, it sounds like it's a bit more complicated than simply, a bunch of companies trying to take away our privacy so they can sell us things. There's more to it than that, isn't there?
Yeah, one of the things, as well as looking at the beginnings of where a kind of private life came from, I was interested in exploring what threatened it. And I tend to think that although the internet and social media has had profound changes, I tend to think culturally we blame it for too much. I'm certain it has some impact, but I don't think we can blame it for the rise in mental health diagnosis entirely. I think there's probably other things going on. Equally the same with privacy. And so I sort of look back at the 20th century and look at the way in which people start to be much more open and talk about being authentic and being being your true self in the public realm, whether it's at work or out and about. And that happens before the internet. It happens before Mark Zuckerberg is a twinkle in his mother's eye. You have things like reality TV programs, which weren't called that then in the 1970s. And I don't think 30 years earlier, people would have done that. There's a sense in which being authentic and not hiding your private self changes really in the 1950s. There's also, so as well as a sort of culture of authenticity that develops before the internet, to kind of carry on the thread from the feminists, from the kind of women in the home, there is a particular strain of radical feminism in the 1970s that has this phrase, the personal is political. And feminists, for very good reasons, partly because of what I was talking about, did want to intervene more in the home. A lot of things that happened in the home, they would argue, were political issues. Abortion is a political issue, they would argue. It's not something that should not be discussed publicly. It shouldn't be kept as a private issue. And so there was a sense in the 70s as well, particularly from that strain of radical feminism, that we need to open up the private realm. Privacy, Catherine McQuinnan, who's a feminist lawyer, says is just kind of a law that men use to beat women. So these two developments, that kind of culture of authenticity and a kind of personal, particular strand of feminist politics, I think open up the private realm before the internet comes. I don't know, I mean, we're all there's some of us are probably sort of my age. I don't know if you remember Big Brother. That was a TV program before the internet. And you can't hear me. Am I flapping around with my So Big Brother was yes, it's television, it's tech, but it's pre the internet. And I think that was a big shift where people got used to being kind of on television the whole time. And also the interesting thing about Big Brother is that they were entirely separate from society. I was really struck with an American episode of Big Brother when the Twin Towers happened. And they didn't tell participants. And you just think, it's almost as if all that mattered for the TV program was what they were doing in private. The outside world no longer mattered. All that mattered really is who they were having sex with and kind of the more kind of animalistic side of ourselves. So I think tech comes in, as in the internet, sort of 1996, and our culture had already changed. And so yes, you do get this woman called Jennifer Ringley, who puts a webcam on her computer and then becomes really famous because she's filming herself 24 hours a day. But tech facilitated that. The culture had already changed. Don't know if you remember the Truman Show, that's pre-tech. So we were already a society of voyeurs that was beginning to suspect the private realm and beginning to suspect privacy before tech comes in. Doesn't mean to say tech has nothing to do with it, but we can't kind of blame tech for everything.
There is, also that element of technology where we give up a lot of our privacy, don't we, in order to gain something, some perceived benefit. And we're kind of encouraged to see it like that. Like if the people who sell things know what you're into, then that will be better for you because they'll be able to give you more of the things that you like.
I think there is, but I have to say, this might sound odd for somebody who's written a book about why privacy is important, but I don't really care that much about people taking my data. I think there are much more interesting and important intrusions into the private realm that we should be worried about. So one is, we're all probably in WhatsApp groups where we're idiots with our friends and colleagues, and it's a slightly, people are odd on WhatsApp, but you can be prosecuted now for what you say on your WhatsApp groups just between your friends. And there's a sense that the privacy of conversation isn't sacrosanct anymore. And I think we live actually in a culture where we're constantly kind of exposing each other in terms of releasing private conversations. And I think that's a more serious incursion into our privacy, because we are stupid in private. We do say bad things. There was one case of this, which was Boris Johnson and Carrie, can't remember his wife's second name. They were recording having an argument over a white sofa that I think he spilt red wine over. And she was saying, you're spoiled, you don't care for anything. That was recorded by their neighbours and put on the front page of The Guardian. So I think that's an invasion of privacy. I think that's more serious, because it sort of suggests that it's entirely normal and okay to do that. So that's the sort of thing I'm more worried about, really.
You start your book talking about Harry and Meghan.
Yeah.
Why?
I needed a catchy hook, but they are a couple who have commodified their private lives, really, as a way of earning a living, as a way of making money and getting on with their lives. But you can see how it kind of ends up not destroying them so much, but they do end up invading their privacy the whole time. Whether it's the recent video that Meghan released of her dance, it was such an intimate, beautiful thing. But you think, why did you need to release that? Why do you need that? And equally, Harry's Spare, great read, but you hear about his frostnip penis, you hear about conversations that he had with his father during his grandfather's funeral. There's this, they need to invade their own privacy, and it commodifies it. And it probably doesn't do family relations any good. Oh. But then you see what happens to Kate Middleton. So she withholds for some time her cancer diagnosis, 3 weeks, I think. And the world goes bonkers, and you think that poor woman can't just have a month with her family to work this out before
I thought it was really interesting at the time that there was lots of very earnest discussion in the media as to whether or not, as a royal, she had the right.
Yeah.
And I was suddenly going, well, hold on, when did we cross that line? But it seemed perfectly valid. It was a constitutional issue that we needed to understand the details of her cancer diagnosis. And I was like, well, I know she's got cancer. Is that not enough?
Yeah.
But apparently it wasn't.
It wasn't enough. And she is a member of a public institution. So in terms of how much money we spend on them, their public duties, those are public issues. But we all need a private life. We all need that space where we don't talk about everything that's going on in our intimate life, for example.
The last person in your seat talked a lot about the difficulties of having a whole career, where she's ended up in a state where she's got a whole career which is all about her, and already being concerned about her own mental health. She didn't find that healthy because partly, I think, she insinuated, partly because she was so open at all times and had no choice. It was sort of her job to do that. When you talk about mental health and invasions of privacy, I'm getting a sense from you that sometimes perhaps we're doing it to ourselves, that this is we open ourselves up so much because everybody tells us we must, and then we feel incredibly damaged because we no longer have a place to retreat to.
I think we need somewhere to retreat to for reflection, to kind of just think through the day, to not think about what we're doing through the eyes of people, through strangers. We definitely need it for intimacy. You always, when you're becoming intimate with a friend or a lover, you tell them things you wouldn't tell anybody else. And that's a kind of, you're being vulnerable. But we also need it to be better persons in the public realm. So, when we come out after a weekend or a holiday, we behave better because we've had that time off. So I think it's crucial. And I think one of the things that sort of happened is that the type of person our culture venerates is the one that does let it hang out, that doesn't have anything to hide. And I actually think, in a way, we sort of need to develop, as well as kind of protect our private life, we also need to develop our public selves, how we are with each other at work or in a place like this, where we're not just our private selves. We put on makeup or we get out of our pajamas. There's this phrase that some people have at work, which is bring your true self to work. And you think, no, bring your professional self to work.
Totally. You don't want to see
By all means, afterwards, having a drink, relax a little. But we do have two sides to ourselves, our professional, our public, as well as our private. And so I'd like to see that sort of distinction made again.
One thing you touched on there is, I think, really interesting, and we've touched on it again earlier. We were talking about sexism in society, and we were talking about how people have certain desires and things that they might not express publicly, and then it comes out online in these online spaces. I think race is another one. In our desire to try and ensure that we live in a just world where people are not going to be, treated prejudicially because of their sex or their race, is there an element that we're kind of then intruding on everyone's heads and what they're thinking? Do you think less of me because of X, Y, or Z? There are times where, I guess what I'm saying is, are we more too bothered about what someone's thinking rather than what they're acting? There's this sense that sometimes we need to wonder about, is she thinking less of me, or is he thinking this? Not how they're acting, but how they're thinking, that private bit where we don't trust them somehow.
I think that might be true, actually. when I did the beginnings of privacy, where it came from, rather than property, I do think it starts in the mind, and what in your heads, and what you have is the kind of religious wars that spread across Europe. You have the battle for Protestantism or Catholicism. And there was this whole series of oaths that people had to swear, which basically said, in terms of Henry VIII, you are the supreme leader, I accept your marriage to Anne Boleyn. And there were these mental kind of battles for what you thought. And it was out of that there was this development of kind of freedom of conscience. And what I think is different to what I might say, today I think that would be seen as hypocrisy. But actually there's all sorts of, and I think even with the policing of language today, some of which you sort of understand and relate to, but I think there's a sort of battle also for our minds that we need to kind of accept that what we think is very different necessarily than what we say.
And yet, coming back to that conversation about just how dark and dangerous some places in the internet can be, do we not want to continue being in people's minds a little bit?
I think Laura Bates was talking about the importance of anonymity. I mean, she did sort of say it's not straightforward, but I think anonymity is really essential. I think people have to be able to do, within limits, bad things in private, rather. I think that's really, really important, and that includes having wrong thoughts we wouldn't necessarily agree with. The place to kind of argue about them is in public, but you let people have them.